The year is 1943. The world is at war, and the most important battle is being fought right here, in the cold, unforgiving waters of the Atlantic Ocean. This is the lifeline, the only thing keeping the Allied war effort alive. Convoys of ships, packed with food, fuel and soldiers, sail from America to Britain. But they are not alone. Beneath the waves, a silent hunter is listening. The German U-boat, a predator that can hear its prey from miles away. These wolf packs are devastating the Allied convoys, sinking ships faster than they can be built. The Allies are losing the war, and they know it. The greatest minds in the world are trying to solve an impossible problem. How do you hide a 10,000-ton steel ship from an enemy that can hear every move you make? They tried everything. New tactics, faster ships, more weapons. Nothing worked. The U-boats just kept listening, and the ships just kept sinking. The answer wouldn't come from an admiral or a scientist in a lab. It would come from the most unexpected person imaginable. A man whose only job was to cook breakfast. This is the incredible true story of Tommy Lawson, a humble ship's cook who noticed something that no one else did and used a simple, brilliant idea to make Allied ships invisible, turning the tide of the entire war. To understand the genius of Tommy Lawson's discovery, you first have to understand the terror of the Atlantic. In the early years of World War II, the Atlantic Ocean was a graveyard. Winston Churchill himself said that the only thing that truly frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril, and for good reason. Everything Britain needed to survive came by sea. Food for its people, steel for its factories, oil for its tanks and planes. Without these convoys, the island nation would starve, and the war would be lost before America could even bring its full power to the fight. The German admiral Karl Dönitz knew this. He created a strategy called the Wolf Pack. Instead of one U-boat hunting alone, he would gather a group of them. They would spread out across the vast ocean, forming a deadly picket line. When one U-boat spotted a convoy, it would signal the others. Then, under the cover of darkness, they would close in for the kill. But how did they find the convoys in the first place? The answer was sound. A ship is an incredibly noisy machine. Think about it. A massive diesel engine with thousands of moving parts vibrating deep in the hull. A giant propeller churning through the water with immense force. All of that vibration, all of that noise travels through the ship's steel frame and out into the ocean. It was a giant announcement, a beacon that broadcasted its location for miles in every direction. The Germans had developed incredibly sensitive underwater microphones called hydrophones. A trained U-boat listener could not only hear a convoy from over 20 miles away, he could tell you how many ships there were, what type of ships they were, and how fast they were going, just by listening to the symphony of their engines. The Allies were in a desperate situation. They were losing hundreds of ships every month. Thousands of sailors and merchant mariners were dying in the icy Atlantic waters. They tried zigzagging patterns to make it harder for U-boats to target them. But the U-boats could still hear them coming. They added more escort ships, like destroyers and corvettes, to hunt the U-boats. But the ocean was just too big. The wolf packs could strike and vanish before the escorts even knew what was happening. Naval engineers were stumped. They tried to build quieter engines. But that would take years to develop and refit the entire fleet. They tried adding soundproofing materials inside the engine rooms, but it barely made a difference. The vibrations were just too powerful. They were shaking the entire steel skeleton of the ship. It seemed like an unsolvable problem. The laws of physics were on the German side. Making a ship silent was like trying to make a thunderclap whisper. For the men on those ships, every voyage was a nightmare. They lived with the constant, gut-wrenching fear of the torpedo that could strike at any second. They were floating targets, helpless, just waiting for the enemy they could not see, but who could always hear them. The morale of the Allied navies was at an all-time low. They needed a miracle. And that miracle was about to come from the ship's kitchen. Thomas Lawson was not a sailor. He was not an engineer. He was a cook. His world was not one of naval charts and acoustic physics. but of peeling potatoes, baking bread, and making sure the crew had a hot meal to look forward to. He was an ordinary man from a small town, doing his part for the war in the only way he knew how. On paper, there was nothing remarkable about him. He was quiet, kept to himself. He did his job, and he did it well. But Tommy had a gift that none of the scientists or admirals had. He was on the ship, 24 hours a day. He didn't just work on the ship. He lived inside the machine. And Tommy was an observer. He paid attention to the little details. He noticed how the vibrations changed when the ship sped up or slowed down. He could feel the difference in the rhythm of the engine when the seas were rough versus when they were calm. To the other crew members, it was just background noise, the constant, unchanging hum of their life at sea. But to Tommy, it was a language. He started to spend his free time not in the mess hall playing cards, but down in the belly of the ship. He would stand near the engine room, feeling the heat and the deafening noise. He would talk to the engineers, the black gang, asking simple, almost childish questions. Why does it shake so much right here? He might ask, pointing to a spot on the deck. The engineers would laugh. That's the propeller shaft, son. That's what pushes us through the water. Tommy would just nod. He wasn't interested in the engineering textbook answer. He was interested in the vibration itself. He began to think of the ship not as a vessel, but as a musical instrument. A giant steel drum, constantly being beaten by the engine and the propeller. And the sound of that drum was broadcasting their position to the entire ocean. He started to see the problem in a different way. The experts were trying to stop the noise at its source by building a quieter engine. That was like trying to build a silent drum. Tommy started to wonder, what if you didn't try to silence the drum? What if, instead, you just stopped the sound from getting out? He thought about the spoon and the dishcloth. The damp cloth had absorbed the vibration. It had dampened the sound. It was a simple principle. But how could you wrap an entire ship engine in a giant wet cloth? It was a crazy, impossible idea. He knew that. But the thought burrowed into his mind and wouldn't let go. He was seeing the problem from the inside out. While the engineers saw a complex mechanical issue, Tommy the cook saw a simple kitchen problem. How do you keep a noisy pot from rattling on the stove? You put a cloth under it. He didn't have the scientific words for it. He didn't know about acoustic impedance or frequency dampening. He just knew what he felt through the soles of his feet and the palms of his hands. The ship was screaming its location to the enemy, and he was becoming obsessed with finding a way to make it stop. He just needed one final piece of the puzzle, and it would come during a moment of sheer terror. It happened on the night of February 19th, 1943. Their convoy, codenamed SC-118, was in the middle of the Black Pit, a notorious stretch of the mid-Atlantic, where there was no air cover. It was a U-boat's paradise, and the Wolfpack had found them. The attack was sudden and brutal. Torpedoes sliced through the dark water. The convoy's escort ships fired back, their depth charges sending huge plumes of water into the air. But it was chaos. Flares lit up the sky, revealing the horrifying sight of ships burning, their hulls ripped open. Tommy was on deck, helping where he could, his cook's duties forgotten in the fight for survival. A ship just a few hundred yards away, the SS Newton, took a direct hit. There was a blinding flash, followed by a deafening roar that echoed across the waves. The ship was doomed. Tommy watched in horror, but even in that moment of terror, his observant mind noticed something strange. As the sea rushed into the gash in the Newton's hull, something changed. The ship's engine was still running, its propeller was still turning, but the sound was fading. It wasn't just getting farther away as the ship sank. The very character of the sound was changing. The deep, vibrating hum that had been broadcasting its location just moments before was being muffled. It was dying. As the cold Atlantic water flooded the engine room and the propeller shaft tunnel, it was choking the vibrations. It was silencing the ship. And that's when it hit him, the single, brilliant, world-changing idea. The engineers were wrong. The admirals were wrong. Everyone was wrong. They were all trying to keep water out of the ship. But Tommy Lawson suddenly realized The answer was to let water in, not in a way that would sink the ship, of course, but in a controlled way. He remembered his experiment with the spoon and the damp cloth. The water, the very ocean that was the U-boat's home, could be the damp cloth. The water was the perfect sound dampener. His mind raced. What if you built a second wall, a thin steel skin, around the noisiest parts of the ship? Around the main engine mounts? Around the entire length of the propeller shaft tunnel? And what if you filled the narrow space in between those two walls with water? The water would act as a natural cushion, a shock absorber. It would soak up the vibrations from the machinery before they could reach the ship's main hull. The vibrations would never make it into the ocean. The ship wouldn't become truly silent, but it would become acoustically invisible. Its loud mechanical signature would be muffled into a quiet, unrecognizable whisper. To the sensitive hydrophones of a U-boat, the ship would simply vanish. It was a solution so simple, so elegant, it was breathtaking. And in the middle of a terrifying U-boat attack, a ship's cook had just discovered the secret to winning the Battle of the Atlantic. Now, he just had to convince someone to listen. Getting his idea from the galley to the Admiralty was a battle in itself. Tommy Lawson was a nobody. He had no rank, no connections, and no engineering degree. When he finally managed to get a meeting with a junior officer, his idea was met with blank stares. He tried to explain it in his simple terms. The water. It soaks up the shaking, he said, making gestures with his hands. You just put a jacket of water around the noisy bits. It's like wrapping a pipe in a wet rag to stop it from rattling. A jacket of water. Son, do you have any idea what you're suggesting? We spend billions of man-hours designing ships to be watertight. We have pumps running day and night to get water out, and you're suggesting we intentionally put it in. They dismissed him out of hand. It was the classic response of experts who couldn't see past their own training. To them, water inside the hull of a ship was called one thing, and one thing only: sinking. They saw it as a dangerous, amateurish idea from a man who didn't understand the basics of naval architecture. One officer famously wrote in a memo, "We must be careful not to waste the department's time with the fanciful notions of civilians." But Tommy was persistent. He knew what he had seen. He knew what he had figured out. He wrote letters. He pestered junior aides. He became a familiar and slightly annoying figure at the naval headquarters. Most people thought he was crazy. A cook who thought he could outsmart the entire German Navy. It was a frustrating, soul-crushing experience. The fate of the free world was at stake, and he held the answer, but the very people he was trying to help refused to listen. They couldn't get past the simple fact that he was just a cook. What could a cook possibly know about acoustics and naval engineering? He almost gave up. He was scheduled to ship out again, back to the dangers of the Atlantic. It seemed his brilliant idea would die with him, an unheard secret. But fate intervened in the form of one man who was willing to listen. Commander Peter Gretton was a rising star in the Royal Navy. He was a decorated escort commander who had seen the horrors of the U-boat war firsthand. He had lost friends, lost ships, and he was desperate for any advantage, no matter how unorthodox. Unlike the older, more traditional officers, Gretton wasn't afraid of new ideas. He heard the whispers about the crazy cook and his water jacket theory. But instead of laughing, he was intrigued. The sheer simplicity of it appealed to him. The logic was sound, even if the source was unconventional. He agreed to meet with Tommy Lawson. Gretton listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't scoff. He asked sharp, intelligent questions. And he saw the genius that everyone else had missed. He understood that Tommy wasn't talking about flooding the ship, but about creating insulated, sealed ballast tanks in strategic locations. It was radical. It was unauthorized, and it was brilliant. Gretton decided to risk his career on the cook's wild idea. He would arrange a secret test. Commander Gretton pulled every string he could. He called in favors. He bent the rules. He managed to secure an old decommissioned freighter for what he officially called ballast experiments. Unofficially, he was building Tommy Lawson's anti-U-boat weapon. A small, trusted team of welders and engineers worked in secret, sworn to silence. They were confused by the strange orders. They were constructing thin, secondary steel walls inside the hull, creating narrow, sealed chambers around the engine mounts and the entire length of the propeller shaft tunnel. It was a bizarre modification, and the rumors flew. But they followed their orders. Tommy was there for the whole process, not as a commander, but as a quiet observer, making sure his simple vision was being built correctly. Finally, the day of the test arrived. The plan was simple. The modified SS Juniper would sail a predetermined course. Nearby a British submarine, the HMS Seraph, would be submerged, its best hydrophone operator listening intently. He had been told only to listen for a merchant ship and record what he heard. He had no idea the ship had been modified. Commander Gretton and Tommy Lawson stood on the bridge of the Juniper. They were both nervous. Gretton had staked his career on this moment. Tommy had staked everything on his one simple observation. The ship's captain was given the order. Full speed ahead, the great engine roared to life. The deck plates began to vibrate. To everyone on board, the ship felt and sounded completely normal. But below the waves, something extraordinary was happening. The operator could hear the escort boats that were miles away. He could hear the splash of a seabird landing on the water half a mile away. But the SS Juniper, the multi-thousand-ton freighter that should have been roaring in his ears, was little more than a whisper. He could barely hear it. He thought his equipment was broken. He radioed the surface. "I can't hear the target vessel," he reported, his voice filled with confusion. "I have faint machinery noise, but it sounds like it's 10 miles away. What is its position?" The reply came back from Gretton's ship. "We are directly over your position." There was a stunned silence on the radio. The hydrophone operator couldn't believe it. A ship was right on top of him, its engine at full power, and it sounded like a ghost. Tommy Lawson had done it. He had made a ship invisible. The test was a resounding, unbelievable success. The data was undeniable. The water jackets had reduced the ship's detectable acoustic signature by over 90%. It was a weapon of war more effective than any gun or torpedo. It was the weapon of silence. The results of the secret test sent shockwaves through the highest levels of the Allied command. The skepticism vanished overnight, replaced by frantic urgency. The cook's idea, once laughed at, was now codenamed Project Neptune's Veil, and it was given the highest priority. The beauty of Tommy's invention was its simplicity. It wasn't a complex new engine that would take years to design and build. It was something that could be added to existing ships during their regular repairs and refits. Shipyards across Britain, Canada, and the United States were given the secret plans. Every new Liberty ship, every convoy freighter, every escort vessel was to be fitted with the water jacket system. The effect on the Battle of the Atlantic was immediate and devastating. For the Germans, U-boat captains would surface in the middle of the ocean, knowing from intelligence that a convoy was supposed to be in the area, only to find nothing but empty water. Their hydrophone operators, once the masters of the deep, were now deaf. Convoys that should have been roaring like lions were now slipping past them like mice. The U-boat kill rates plummeted. For the first time in the war, the Allies were sinking U-boats faster than the Germans could build them. The wolf packs were starving. Their primary advantage, their ability to hear, had been taken away from them. They were forced to hunt by sight, surfacing more often, which made them vulnerable to the ever-increasing number of Allied aircraft equipped with new powerful radar. The tide had turned. The lifeline to Britain was secure. The massive buildup of American troops and equipment for the D-Day invasion could now proceed with much less risk. The victory in the Battle of the Atlantic, the longest and most crucial battle of the war, was now within reach. And it was all thanks to a breakthrough that came not from a scientist, but from a cook who knew how to listen. And what happened to Tommy Lawson? He never sought fame or recognition. He was offered a commission as a naval officer, a medal, a promotion. He turned them all down. He had done what he set out to do. After the war, he returned to his quiet life, his monumental contribution to victory remaining a classified secret for decades. History is filled with stories of great generals and famous leaders, but often the course of history is turned by ordinary people who see the world in a different way. People like Tommy Lawson, a humble ship's cook, who felt the pulse of a machine and saw a truth that had eluded the experts. His story is a powerful reminder that the greatest weapon in any war is not a gun or a ship or a plane. It is the power of a simple revolutionary idea. He didn't just help win a battle, he silenced the seas.